periodically in life, that you should never, ever, ever click send either before you've slept on it or showed it to your wife. And I usually do both, and this time I did neither, and I wrote something really unbelievably stupid and angry, for which I'm still paying a little bit, but that's okay. But I should have shown it to my wife. By the way, I know what she would have said, because this is an uncanny woman. I get up in the morning, I write for an hour or so, then I go to Minion in the morning. I can wear whatever I want. I put on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, walk out to Minion, come back, work out. Then it's time to get ready to go to work. So you have to dress for work. Go in my room. She's still fast asleep. And the room is, it's early still, it's okay. And the room is pitch black. Because I'm an unbelievably sensitive and caring soul, I tiptoe in. This happens every morning. I tiptoe in, I open the closet, I know exactly where everything is. I take out this and I take out that, and I'm going to tiptoe out and get dressed outside of the room. It's pitch black, she's fast asleep, and I hear, it doesn't go. Okay? Now, if the woman can tell me in the pitch black while she's fast asleep that it doesn't go, what am I going to do? Show her a controversial article? And then what she says is, when she finally reads it, oh yeah, we have 4 friends left. I guess you don't want those either, right? Which is why I rarely show her things before I click send, but I do at least sleep on it, and this time I didn't. But I say that only by way of saying, because what I'm going to say later is going to make it sound like it's not a huge issue. It's a huge issue. I want to make it very clear. I think it's a huge issue. I think that what Bibi Netanyahu did was shameful and inexcusable, because once you make a deal, your word should mean something. It could be a good deal, it could be a bad deal. The women at the wall or the egalitarian service of the Kotel could be the right fight, it could be the wrong fight. You can have that argument all day long. But once you make a deal and you shake hands, it should actually mean something. And in abandoning the deal that he made, I think it was a shameful exercise in just complete political both cowardice and opportunism at exactly the same time. And so that's one example. Another example is the ultra right-wing rabbinate's definition of who is a Jew, not accepting conservative conversions, not accepting, by the way, even the conversions of many Orthodox rabbis in America these days. So you have an Orthodox rabbinate that's out of touch with American Jewish life in general, not just Reform and conservative Jews, but with even many Orthodox Jews as well. Those are all the kinds of issues that people use as an explanation. Israel's a country that's using power too much. Israel's a country that's becoming kind of an Orthodox stranglehold on conversion, on public spaces, on whatever. People like Naftali Bennett, who was sitting at the next table next to me at lunch today, who says all kinds of crazy things, when there's a Gaza war and we're going to go all the way to the sea. Yeah, and then what are you going to do when you get to the sea? Exactly, we've got out of there finally. Or, he says we should annex Area C and the other C, SEA, we should annex Area C, letter C. There's people like Naftali Bennett and Lieberman and others who are all very smart, by the way. Very, very, very smart. But they say things that kind of don't wash with the former American sense of nuance in the political arena. And therefore we think that those are all issues that somehow they've come to hit some sort of perfect storm. And now we have this enormous conflict between American Jews and Israel. And I'm going to tell you now why I think that's not true. Why, of course, the Kotel's a big deal. And why conversions are a big deal. And while Israel at war is distressing and depressing and very often discomfiting, that's all true. But none of that, it seems to me, is the cause of the underlying tension. And I will once again use the home setting as an example for this. The following I have never experienced myself, but I've read about it in a lot of important magazines, right? Somebody leaves dishes in the sink, right? And then the other person comes in and just blows a gasket, right? And then have a little dust up about the dishes in the sink. We're all smart enough to know that the dust up is not about the dishes in the sink. If everybody's happy and feeling content, somebody just washes the dishes and puts them away, and it's the end of the discussion. When little things like that lead to a major dust-up, what you know is that there's an underlying issue that has not gotten surfaced, and the dishes are the surfacing of the issue. Whether somebody's feeling not honored because they have their time, or there's money issues, or there's whatever. It could be 1,000 things. How do we know that these issues that I mentioned before are not the real cause of the dust-up? Because the tensions between American Judaism and Israel precede the creation of the State of Israel. So I will give you just a couple examples, but there's many, many more that could be given. In 1921, Louis Brandeis, who's then a sitting Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, becomes really the titular head of the World Zionist movement. We're not going to go into all the political machinations that led to that. No, I think it was 1919. I think it was 1919. He becomes the head of the International Zionist movement, and he very quickly locks horns with Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann had a really good week last week because he was instrumental in getting the Balfour Declaration issued, and last week was 100 years since the Balfour Declaration. So a lot of people who hadn't heard Chaim Weizmann's name in a very, very long time heard him discussed a lot last week, and rightly so. He was an extraordinary person. We're not going to have time to go into the details tonight, but over the course of a couple of years, coming to a head in 1921, Brandeis and Weizmann are at each other's throats about a lot of political stupidities, budgets here and budgets there, but fundamentally, what Weizmann said was that Zionism is actually kind of the Jewish experiment in the Middle East that will enable American Jews to become better Jews and better Americans. By becoming Zionists, American Jews are going to become not only better Jews, but they're going to become better Americans. Are they going to move there? Of course not. But this is fundamentally a profound intellectual challenge for the Jews to get into state making. And once we learn how complex state making is, we can participate in state making here a little bit more. It wasn't an entirely coherent worldview, but he felt it very strongly. Chaim Weizmann, who came from Eastern Europe, saw Zionism as something entirely different. Zionism was a way that the Jews were going to save the Jewish people. It wasn't an intellectual exercise. It wasn't about making American Jews better Americans. It wasn't about any of those kinds of sort of lovely salon kinds of issues. It was about saving the Jewish people before it was too late. Now, nobody knew in 1921 how close it was to it being too late. But people in the Zionist movement had been saying since the late 1800s, and certainly by Kishinev in 1903, that Europe was going to a very dark place. They just didn't have any idea exactly how dark it was going to get. There's an ultimate blow-up in 1921 in which Brandeis and Weizmann come to loggerheads, and at the end, Weizmann wins, and Brandeis is effectively forced out of the Zionist movement for all intents and purposes. He ceases becoming a major player, and Weizmann's very famous phrase is, "There is no bridge between Pinsk and Washington, D.C." Meaning, you and I come from different worlds. We really don't understand each other. We both call ourselves Zionists. We're both talking about the importance of some Jewish project in the Middle East. But we're talking about something entirely different when you talk and when I talk. There's no bridge between my town, Pinsk. He was born right near Pinsk. But there's no bridge between my town, Pinsk, and the town where you work as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. That was his claim. Now we can fast forward to 1948. The State of Israel gets created. David Ben-Gurion, when he is not standing on his head at the beach, is running the country and comes over to the United States talking about at least two issues. One is the Jews should make Aliyah, and the other is that now the Jewish world has a new center. Don't forget that at that point, 5% of the world's Jews lived in Israel. In 1948, 5% of the world's Jews lived in Israel. And David Ben-Gurion trots over here, obviously on an airplane, and starts talking about American Jews. Let's go, let's go. For 2,000 years we've been waiting, now we have it. Come on, let's go. And we have a new center. The most important Jewish organization back then in the United States was the American Jewish Committee. Still an exceedingly important organization, but back then it was the massive Jewish organization. When the AJC spoke, American Judaism spoke, for all intents and purposes. And the head of the AJC at that point was a man named Jacob Blaustein from Baltimore, Maryland. And Jacob Blaustein and David Ben-Gurion got along less well than Brandeis and Weizmann. Okay? It made Brandeis-Weizmann look like a love fest. And at a certain point, Blaustein in the early 1950s, in 1951-52, issues a very long paper, which is part of what's called the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion Agreement, which you can still find, by the way, on the AJC website. All these archives are right there for everybody to go see. His paper is called The Voice of Reason. And in The Voice of Reason, he warns David Ben-Gurion in no uncertain terms. Don't come over here anymore and talking about Aliyah. We're not going. We live here. We don't want to go there. And we don't need an alternative to America. People in Europe did. We don't. There's going to be no question of our dual loyalties. Our loyalty is here. As for the idea that the Jewish center is now in Palestine, what are you talking about? Now you have 6% of the world's Jews. I mean, you're not the center of the world's Jews. There is no other center. There are lots of Jewish places all across the world. You can't claim the center. And then Blaustein says something really extraordinary. He reminds Ben-Gurion of the following. He said, when we, the American Jewish Committee, decided in 1947 to support the partition plan, which culminated, of course, on November 29, 1947, with that very famous vote. When we supported partition, Blaustein said, we did it because the creation of a Jewish state seemed to us the most practicable solution to an urgent problem, which was several 100,000 Jewish displaced persons in Europe. That's why we voted for partition, or urged partition. We weren't interested in the revitalization of the Jewish people in its ancestral homeland. You Eastern Europeans talk that way. We weren't interested in a refuge for us. We have no intention of going. What he didn't say, but it's clear that he meant, was if they can't go there, they're going to come here. And we don't need that. Ironically, Blaustein was the first head of the American Jewish Committee who was part of the Eastern European immigration, because until that point, the Germans, who've been part of the Western European immigration in the earlier part of the 19th century, didn't want the Eastern Europeans. So this pattern of the Jews not wanting new people coming in, and don't forget, there was some of that, by the way, when the Russians came here, and there was some of that about Israelis who were called Yordim, as if people here have a choice about where they want to live, but people there have no choice about where they want to live. So there have been successive waves of American Jews having not a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for other Jews coming in, and Blaustein and Ben-Gurion have an enormous fight, which never really gets resolved, before there's a Palestinian people, before there's a chief rabbinate that is ultra-Orthodox, before anybody's thinking about conversion, before anybody's talking about the Kotel. Israel doesn't even have the Kotel. It's in Jordan at that point. And Israel and American Jews are at loggerheads. Fast forward to 1973. Fast forward to 1973. It's a disastrous month, the month of October. Right? In 1967, Israel in 6 days triples its size and loses 600 soldiers. It's not a small amount of soldiers, but it could have been a lot worse. In 1973, Israel, in the first 10 days of the war mostly, but not only, but in the course of basically a 20-day war, claws its way back to the borders from which it started and loses 3,000 soldiers. It's a disaster. And there is a tremendous sense of kind of darkness hovering over Israel, which I would argue, by the way, and I argue in the book, Israel's never quite really emerged from, but reasonable minds can differ. And American Jews, a few prominent American Jews, say, in the days after the Yom Kippur War, when the tanks are still smoldering and the graves are still fresh and the hospitals are still filled and Israelis are still in shock, some very important heads of the American Jewish community say, it is going to be a pleasure now to deal with a diminished Israel. They didn't like that cocky Israel that emerged out of 1967 that felt it could do whatever the hell it wanted to do. And while they weren't obviously happy that 3,000 Jewish boys died going to defend the state, they weren't unhappy that Israel was going to be a little bit less full of itself. To be able to say that, by the way, even to yourself, but certainly out loud, to be able to say that when the graves are still fresh and the families are still shattered and the country is still staggering, reflects a deep-seated antipathy that, once again, I'll remind you, has got nothing to do with conversion. And that has nothing to do with the Kotel, nothing to do with Palestinians. The Palestinian issue was not an issue in 1973. For all intents and purposes, it was starting, but it wasn't really an issue. So whether you want to look at Blaustein and Ben-Gurion, or you want to go backwards and look at Weitzman and Brandeis, you want to go forward and look at those kinds of comments after 73, what I wanted you to see very quickly is that the history of tension between American Jews and Israel goes back long before any of the issues that are supposedly or allegedly at the core of the tension that we feel now. So what is it about? And here's what I want to suggest to you. And again, I'm not suggesting that the conversion issue is not important. And I'm not suggesting that the Kotel is not important or that the Palestinian thing isn't horribly sad in a gazillion different ways. But I want to suggest that the real core issue is this. Israel and American Judaism, which between the two of them comprise something like 85, 87% of world Jewry. So you can't say this in London, you can't say this in Paris, and you can't say this in Sydney or Melbourne or Johannesburg. But the future of the Jewish world is going to get determined in the United States and in Israel. The others are interesting, but they're too small numerically to actually make much difference, or so at least seems at the moment. The United States, or American Jewish life, and Israel are radically different bets on the Jewish future. We like to think, those Israelis, they're kind of just like us, right? We have a Declaration of Independence, they have a Declaration of Independence. We have 800 numbers, they have 800 numbers. We're a democracy, they're a democracy, right? They speak Hebrew, it's true. They eat falafel, it's true. But basically, they're a Hebrew-speaking, falafel-eating version of exactly what we are. And whenever they behave exactly like we want them to behave, they look like us, we feel great. But when they get that annoying sense that they should be different, things go kerflooey. Now, why is that? Because fundamentally, these experiments are radically different experiments. And I want to try to explain briefly in the basic ways, or the raw outlines of how they're really very, very different. The United States, or American Jewish life, is basically the following bet. The diaspora model works. True, it didn't end well in England in 1290. And true, it didn't end well in Spain in 1492. And true, it didn't end well in Germany in the 1930s. But the model works. And if you take the model and you put it on the most welcoming, the most hospitable, the most moderate territory that you can possibly imagine, which is the United States of America, it can have a different outcome than England or Spain or Germany. This time it can really work. American Jewish life is about taking the diasporic model, which is living as a minority in a larger society, accommodating oneself in some way to its cultural norms and its political norms and its religious norms and its legal norms, and making as profound and energetic and creative a Jewish world as you can, but fundamentally the same way that the Jews did in the 1400s, and fundamentally the same way that the Jews did in Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century, and so on and so forth. And Zionism is a suggestion that is dead wrong. What the Zionists said then, and many of them still say today, is it has never worked, and you're naive to think it's going to work now. And by the way, their argument is stronger now than it was 6 months ago. No, I say that without any kidding around whatsoever, right? But when I was in college, when I mentioned, the Saudis back then, nobody thought you'd turn on the TV and see people in Charlottesville holding up signs that say Jews will not replace us, and have the President of the United States say, well, some very good people on both sides. Now, that validates the Zionist critique of the diasporic model in a very serious way. And we're not going to get into the whole political thing here and all of that. It's simply to say that Zionism was not sort of, you do your thing here, we'll do our thing there. It's that your thing and our thing are fundamentally opposite bets about the Jewish future. You're going to accommodate yourself to being a minority in a much larger majority and having to make all of the accommodations that means. And we, and here comes this Israeli boisterousness, are going to accommodate ourselves to exactly no one. We're done with that. That gave us Kishinev. That gave us Auschwitz. That gave us the Auto da Fe. That gave us England in 1290. We're done. Now, we never talk that way. Because like good couples who have underlying issues, we never surface them. But that's the real issue. American Jews fundamentally think that living as a minority in an incredibly hospitable land is a good, solid bet on the Jewish future. And that putting all of your chickens in the basket of one very hostile territory in a very different part of the world is not a very smart idea. And the Zionists say, yeah, it's not a very good neighborhood. We're quite aware of that, which is why you shouldn't tell us how to behave in it. But fundamentally, you're betting on exactly the model that has failed time and time and time again. And we start from that proposition. Then, of course, because we live in very different settings and very different propositions, we end up defining what it means to be a Jew very differently. What happens in America is that Judaism has become primarily a religion. Not only, but fundamentally, primarily a religion, whereas in Israel, Judaism has become primarily, again, not only, but primarily a people or an ethnicity. So think about it. You're sitting in this congregation right here, and you want to say you want to have an event for everybody outside and within 20 miles of this place. You want to have Jews and Gentiles, non-Jews, Christians, whatever. We do the same thing in Jerusalem. We say we want to have Jews and Arabs. Nobody says Muslims, because Arabs come in all different kinds of religious forms. Here, fundamentally, when you say Jews and Christians, or Jews and Gentiles, or Jews and non-Jews, what you mean by Jews are members of a certain religion. There, when you talk about Jews and Arabs, you mean by Jews people of a certain ethnicity, people of a certain people of a certain peoplehood, or something along those lines. And what that leads you to is very different conceptions of what it means to be a Jew. Very different conceptions of a whole sort of lists that we really can't go into now. But you start out with the minority-majority thing, and then what that leads you to are very different conceptions. Now you ask yourself, by the way, so why are we so bent out of shape in America about this ridiculously antiquated medieval Israeli rabbinate? And Israelis, most of whom are not observant, go chugging along. How come we're angry and we don't even live there, and you guys live there and you don't seem to get bent out of shape about it? Because their fundamental definition of themselves has very little to do with Jewish religion. They might go to shul, they might not go to shul. If they go to shul for reasons we'll come back to shortly, they just couldn't care less what the chief rabbinate thinks. You can get married without the chief rabbinate. It's not legal, but you can do it. My daughter did it. I was the perpetrator. But, I mean, no, whatever. But you can do that. You can't get divorced without the chief rabbinate. It's true, you can get buried without the chief rabbinate. You can have children and name them without the chief rabbinate. Most Israelis say whatever they want to do, they want to do. And most American Jews, by the way, the people who are furious about the chief rabbinate, it's not going to affect them. In other words, you're enraged, but nobody in your family is converting and needing to be recognized by the state of Israel. You're enraged, but how many times a decade do you go daven at the kotel? Right? I mean, I live a 15-minute walk from the kotel, and it's been more than a decade since I've davened at the kotel. Now it's because we were invited to a bar mitzvah that my wife said I had to go to. Right? I mean, so it's ironic. The people that live there, that actually live under the thumb of the thing, say, oh, whatever. And you, who live here, who really aren't affected in your own personal lives, like me, get totally blown and bent out of shape. And that's in large measure because if one there repudiates the religious legitimacy of the Jew here, you say that I have nothing to do with you. You don't want any part of me. And in Israel, if somebody says the chief rabbinate doesn't recognize my form of religiosity, so that's fine. I don't like their form of dress. I don't care. So you start with majority-minority. You get to religion versus peoplehood. It's also, therefore, a very different kind of a conception of what's our place in the world. For American Jews, life in the contemporary world is fundamentally defined by a universal impulse. Right? There are differences, but in an ideal world, a kind of an Isaiah, idealized, left-wing, American, academic, democratic world, we're one big happy human family. And whatever differences there are, they are. Race is not going to go away because that's how genes work. And there may be different religions, there may be different customs, but fundamentally, we can all just be part of the same thing. So when you ask a lot of young American Jews, what is your Judaism fundamentally about? It's about tikkun olam. By the way, not l'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to fix the world in God's kingdom, but just to repair the world. I always find that answer problematic, not because I'm against repairing the world, but because it implies that Christians don't want to repair the world, which I think they do. And it implies that people that aren't part of any religious community don't want to repair the world, which I think they do. And then implies that American Muslims don't want to repair the world, which I think many of them do, and so on and so on and so forth. When somebody asks you, what's your Jewishness all about? What you actually say is something that every religion is all about, and that every decent society is all about. So tikkun olam is not instead of mitzvot and this and that, of course it is, but tikkun olam is actually instead of particularity. What tikkun olam is code for is, I'm just like everybody else. I may do my thing in Hebrew, they may do my thing in English. I may have, my thing on Saturday, they may do their thing on Sunday. I have Passover, they have Easter, I have Purim, they have Halloween, I have Hanukkah, they have Christmas. But at the end of the day, really, it's about tikkun olam. And so I can meet in the soup kitchen in downtown, and the people from the Protestant church, and the people from the mosque, and the people from the synagogue, we can all work together, and it's the ultimate embodiment of what our faith is all about. And Israelis might actually agree with part of that, but they're going to say, what are you actually talking about? The whole idea of the Jewish people from the book of Genesis onwards is, all the nations and families of the world will be blessed by you and your descendants, meaning you're going to have something to offer other people. You're going to be different. You're going to be different. You're not the same. We don't have time to go tonight into the whole story of the Tower of Babel, but the Tower of Babel appears in the book of Genesis right after Noah's sons get off the ark and then actually begin to come. They move out into various places. This child goes there, this child goes there, this child goes there. They speak one language, they speak a second language, they speak a third language. They have some customs, they have different customs, these have still other customs. And that's what God seems to want when the ark settles down. Different peoples doing different things in different places. And then comes the Tower of Babel and says, and then the whole world was one language and few words. Everybody spoke the same thing. They start to build this tower. That, says the Bible, what God did not want. God did not want human homogeneity. God wanted, said Genesis, human heterogeneity. And the idea of Jewish profound difference has always been, I think, at the core of the way the Jews have spoken about themselves until relatively recently. And it is very much at the core of how Israelis speak about themselves. Israelis are not in the business of hiding the fact that we're different. Israelis are not in the business of hiding the fact that our traditions are different than Christians and our traditions are different than Muslims and so on and so forth. So you have, again, a minority living as a minority, living as a majority, living mostly as a religion, living mostly as a peoplehood, a universalist take on the world versus a particularist take on the world. I'm going to give you two more, then wrap up a little bit, and we'll begin to discuss it a little bit. There is also a fundamental difference. America, and I know America, and this is not meant as a joke, right? I mean, America is going through a very painful, powerful, there's a way in which one could describe what's going on now. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out, obviously, but as a kind of little mini American revolution. And I would commend to your reading a couple of books. One of them is called Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild, Arlie Hochschild, something like that. But Strangers in Their Own Land, written by an anthropologist from Berkeley, who goes within the last 5 years, long before Trump, but within the last 5 years or so, to Louisiana to try to figure out what makes people who desperately need the federal government to fix their lives vote for the Tea Party and therefore for small government. These people are not stupid. They don't have the same educational degrees that a lot of people in this sanctuary tonight have, but they are not stupid. They're not country bumpkins. They're not racists. They do have self-interest like every other normal human being. So why in the world do they vote that way? Now, you got to read that book to understand. We're not going to discuss it tonight, but it's to say that something very seismic is happening in America, and we don't know quite where it's going yet. But fundamentally, outside the red states, in the blue world in which most of us live, and in the blue world in which most of our children and grandchildren live, the impulse is fundamentally liberal. It's liberal on most issues. It's liberal when it comes to gender. It's liberal when it comes to sexual orientation. It's liberal when it comes to, virtually everything that you can possibly think of. Here's part of what's happening in Israeli society, which is another thing that we never talk about. I'm guilty of this in the book too, because I couldn't figure out any way to get around it. But when you want to start telling the story of Zionism, you start in Europe. What are you going to do? That's where Theodor Herzl lived. It's not his fault, it's his parents' fault. Right? But that's where Theodor Herzl lived. That's where Ahad Ha'am lived. That's where Jabotinsky lived. That's where Heinrich Gretz, who was the predecessor of all these guys, lived. That's where, all of these guys, and they were guys, sorry to say, but that's where these people lived. And so you tell a story that starts in Paris, it starts in Austria, it starts in various places around Moscow, and then it eventually comes to Palestine. And then we say, oh yeah, then in 1948, by the way, then because Israel was at war with all the Arab countries forced out kicked out, expelled, pressured, whatever you want to say, 700,000 Jews from North Africa primarily, who made their way to Israel between the 1948 and the mid-1950s. And that's when we got our little Mizrahi population, and we weren't really so nice to them. We really should have been a lot nicer. We put them into all of these places called ma'abarot, which were like sort of Quonset huts and, rows and rows of Quonset huts, which in the summer were baking hot, and in the winter were filled with mud. And now Israel's poorer cities like Sderot and Yerucham, etc. Sderot and Yerucham just started out as ma'abarot, as did Talpiot in Jerusalem, for example. And, we really should do a better job making up to these people how we didn't really give them their fair shake. Now that's all true. But here's the little rub. Those people are the majority of Israeli Jews. They're not the afterthought. They're not the footnote. There are more of them than there are of us. If most of us in this room are Ashkenazim, there's a few people who are probably not, but most of us in this room are Ashkenazim. We are in Israel among the Jews. Forget among everybody else. Among the Jews, we're a minority. Not a small minority yet. Not a small minority, but they are more, and their birth rate is higher, and this is only going to go in that direction. And their instincts are very different than our instincts. Their instinct is fundamentally to be distrustful of one's enemies. Our instinct, especially in America, is embrace your enemy, you can work this out. They say, I hear that, but in Roslyn, the nearest Muslim community that threw out the Jews is not so close. But my parents were thrown out. I think I know a little bit more about them than you do. That's what they say. And their instinct is, while it's very nice that people in Europe or in North America sort of, you gotta make peace, you gotta sit together. We lived there. We actually know how it ended. We're not terribly inclined. So politically, they're much more instinctively right-wing. They are more instinctively socially conservative. Women in that community go to college, go to law school, go to medical school, and so on and so forth. But a friend of mine who was an editor of an important Israeli publication when the whole Kotel thing happened, called a bunch of his friends who are all Mizrahi couples. They're all super successful. Doctors, lawyers, finance people, high-tech people. The men and the women equally successful. But they're Mizrahi. And what does the woman do? She's a surgeon. What does the woman do? She's in finance. What does the woman do? She's in high-tech. And then he says, what do you think of this egalitarian minion at the wall? What do you make of that whole thing? And they're like, why is that even an issue? Who cares about that? Because they have a much different social instinct than we do. They have a very different instinct about gender roles. They have a very different instinct about sexual orientation. They have a very different instinct about a whole lot of things. They are also, by the way, religiously built very differently than our intellectual instincts. I don't know how many of you remember, I don't know, this has got to be 40 years ago. Elliot Dorff, who's one of the reigning great minds of the conservative movement to this very day, put out a book called Conservative Judaism, Our Ancestors to Our Descendants. And that book, which is a very nice book, had 2 pages which were read more than any other pages of the book, which was a chart. A chart on 2 pages. You have Reform, and then Conservative 1, 2, 3, 4, and Orthodox, maybe it's the other order, I forget. And everybody's trying to figure out, if you believe that God said this at Sinai, then the authority of the mitzvot is that. So therefore you can change this and you can't change that. And it was all very, back in the day you couldn't do that. But today it would be click, insert, table, make the number of rows, style it, click save, and you're done. Mizrahi Jews don't think that way. Poll after poll after shows, if you ask Mizrahi Jews, do you believe that God gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai? The answer is overwhelmingly yes, in the 80s or the 90s, percentage-wise. Do you believe that there is a system of divine reward and punishment? Yes, 80s or 90s. Will you go to shul on Friday or Shabbat morning and then in the car and drive to the beach? Yes, 80s or 90s. Now we laugh, right? We laugh. And we say, how's that possible? You guys don't get it. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And they would say, not in this language, but here's what they would say. What the most important things in your life are fundamentally rational? The love that you feel for the people that you love is rational? The things that make you crazy and really get you to be the kind of person that you don't want to be is rational? No, in fact, the parts of your life that make you who you are fundamentally instinctive. They're not rational. Love's not rational, hate's not rational, also religion's not rational in a lot of ways. And their argument is that what their religion demands of them is reverence, not obedience. And this is Meir Buzaglo's way of talking about it. He's a professor in Israel. What he says is in the Ashkenazi world, what Orthodox Jews think their rabbi demands of them is obedience. And in the Mizrahi world, what Jews think is demanded of them is reverence. Go to shul, show deep respect, don't question, leave the tradition alone. You know your role, they know their role, the rabbi knows his role, not his or her, the rabbi knows his role. And then as long as you don't do anything kind of grossly disrespectful, do what you want. Now, are all Mizrahim that way? No. The Haredi world has begun to affect the Mizrahi world to a certain extent, and we're seeing changes there as well. But there's a difference between the religiosities of American Ashkenazim and Israeli Mizrahim, and I remind you that Israeli Mizrahim are now a majority of Israeli Jews, which just makes the religious impulses also very different. And one last thing, and then I want to summarize and make one last point, and we'll stop. This is an entirely voluntary Jewish community. We talk about affiliation rates. The affiliation rate in Israel is 100% because they find you. You don't have to be interested in signing up when you turn 18. They find you. Right? In Israel, how did all those really smart kids get the letter from the Air Force and those other kids didn't get the letter from the Air Force? Now, that's an interesting crapshoot. Oh, it's an interesting crapshoot unless you think about the fact that there is no such thing as a sealed educational record in Israel. The army can see whatever it wants, and it goes snooping around your high school grades while you're in high school, looking for exactly the kids that it wants, for this and for that and for the other thing. And when you turn 18, you get a tzav, you get a little order, and then you fill out this thing called a manila, and the rest of it is history. And it changes your life in many cases. Right, my son, you should know, I don't know how old he is. I think he's 27. My son is 27. If I tell my wife, I'll kill you. But my son who's 27 just got out of the army about a little bit less than he's 28. He got out of the army a little less than 2 years ago after 8 years in the army. That means when he was 26, he'd been in the army since he was 18. That's a pretty big percentage of your adult life, like 100% of it. And to go to college for the first time at 26, 27, there was nothing voluntary. I mean, he didn't have to sign on to do that much more, but he did for a whole array of reasons. But it's an entirely non-voluntary society. This is an entirely voluntary society. When I lived in LA for all those years, we talked about the fact that the affiliation rate was 20% in Los Angeles, which meant 80% of the people in LA who were Jewish were not on the list of any single Jewish organization anywhere, didn't do anything that a private detective would be able to say, oh, that identifies them as a Jew. They were Jews, but that was basically the extent of it. And therefore, the idea of a society in which your sense of autonomy or your actual autonomy is attenuated because of a larger goal is a very natural thing to Israelis and a very unnatural thing to Americans. And so when Israelis say, my autonomy, I value it, and we're a fundamentally liberal democratic society, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff that I don't get to decide. That also doesn't wash well with American Jews. And one of the ironies of it is that it produces this non-voluntary society, much higher per capita rates of voluntarism than the non-voluntary society in the United States produces. It's very ironic. Israelis per capita, studies show this, Israelis per capita volunteer many more hours a day and a week and a month and so on and so forth, even though they live in a world which is always telling them what to do, because it kind of inculcates a sense of duty to something far beyond yourself, in which, by the way, I think America would be a far better country if all of its students and children at the age of 18 served their country for a year or two. You grow up in the world's greatest democracy, give something back to it. There's nothing at all inhuman about that. You don't have to be a soldier. You can go on the Peace Corps. You can teach for America. You can teach English to people who can't teach, whatever. But this idea that, it's an ordained right once you graduate high school, that you go to college, and then when you graduate college, you go to graduate school, and when you graduate graduate school, you get a postdoc. That's not in the Bible, right? What's in the Bible is that there's something more important to you that really matters. So to go back to the majority-minority religion, peoplehood, universalism, particularism, liberal, conservative, voluntary, non-voluntary, what does it all add up to? These are really different animals. And they see the world radically differently. They see the use of force differently. They see what it means to have an enemy differently. They see the sense of belonging differently. They understand what Judaism is differently. And so, yeah, democracy, Declaration of Independence, 800 numbers, that's all true. But these are fundamentally different bets on the Jewish future. And that's what's really going on. The years when we kind of were so in awe of the creation of Israel, your children and your grandchildren are not so in awe of the creation of Israel. They think it's as natural as the rising of the sun. They don't remember the month before 1967. I do. And many of you do. They don't remember those first 10 days of 73. I do. And many of you do. They just don't. They just don't. And therefore, there's a whole different sense of what requires our absolute devotion and what doesn't require our absolute devotion. So far, though, we have been thinking, I think, as American Jews and as Israeli Jews, that this is a zero-sum game. Either you're going to have the power or we're going to have the power. Either your view of the world is going to prevail or our view of the world is going to prevail. And in my last closing minutes, what I want to do is to suggest that that's a terrible idea, to look at the world that way. For the following reason. The Jewish world has always gotten it wrong when it guesses what's going to survive. Always get it wrong. After the destruction of the Second Temple, the idea that the Pharisees would become the prevailing religious worldview that would then reside in Poland for 600 years would have been unthinkable. But that's exactly what happened. When Menachem Begin's assistant Yechiel Kadishai first heard in Palestine in the late 1930s, he and his buddies heard a rumor that Hitler was going to try to, beginning of the 40s, I guess, that Hitler was going to try to wipe out Polish Jewry. You know what they did? They laughed. They said, you can't wipe out 3 million people. It's 3 million Jews in Europe. You can't destroy 3 million people. Well, you actually can. You can. And at the end of the war, there were 300,000 left. He actually sent 90% of them up smokestacks. And now today there's like 30,000. If you look at Polish Jewry, Hitler won. But very Zionist, very decent people in the early 1940s, when they heard about Poland and Hitler's plan to destroy it, they actually laughed. They stopped laughing very quickly and started to get active, and that's where Chana Senech comes in and all that kind of stuff. But they laughed because it was unthinkable. In 1948, 5% of the world's Jews lived in Palestine and Israel. 5%. It's the world's largest Jewish community. Nobody would have foreseen it. We always get it wrong. And so to say, my worldview, whether it's here in America or my worldview, whether it's here in Israel, this is the one that's going to win, to hell with them, that's very stupid. Because we actually don't know which one's going to win. And it may be some variant that we haven't even begun to see yet. And I think it's the nature of Jewish history that commands us never to say that a huge swath of the Jewish people doesn't matter. It all matters. We all matter. And this is a grand experiment here in the United States. It's a grand, magnificent bet on the Jewish future with extraordinary accomplishments and very profound vulnerabilities. And Israel is an unbelievably unforeseen triumph that nobody could have imagined, with extraordinary accomplishments and very profound vulnerabilities. I think the challenge to us as American Jews and Israeli Jews is to look at the world and to understand that our differences are not about the Kotel. They're not about egalitarian minyanim at the Kotel, or the chief rabbi approving this conversion or that conversion, or the way the Israelis conduct the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Our differences are fundamental about what we think it means to be a Jew. Our differences are fundamental about what we think it's going to take for the Jewish people to survive. Our differences are fundamentally about that we live in societies that are completely, utterly different from the other, and we have chosen those differences because we believe in them here, and we believe in them here, and we're both unabashedly proud of the societies that we've built, and rightly so. The question is, can we, instead of arguing about the trivialities, well, we have to argue about them, by the way, we can't give up those fights. We can't give them up. Can we at the same time try to see the world through the eyes of the other? Can Israelis try to understand how the liberal impulse in American Jewish life is one of the best products of being part of the world's greatest democracy? Can American Jews come to understand what it means to, for the first time in 2,000 years, not be afraid? And then ask themselves, when for the first time you're not afraid, what do you do with enemies that actually threaten you? Maybe you respond differently than you respond on Long Island. Can we begin to get into each other's religious eyes and each other's social eyes and each other's cultural eyes and so on and so forth, and try to see the world from the point of view that the other sees it? So that we agree? No. But so that we understand? Yes. And to move forward doing two things that seem utterly, sort of, that they don't go one with the other, but that I think are critically important. One is, if we've chosen to live here, to make it our life's business, to make this Jewish community the very best, most resilient, strongest, powerful, creative, moral Jewish community that it can possibly be. And if we've chosen to live our lives there, to make the Jewish community there the strongest, most resilient, moral, etc., creative Jewish community that it can possibly be. And if we've chosen to live here because we think this is the model that really is going to work, and to throw our heart and soul into it with tremendous pride because that's what we think. And if we live over there because we think that model is the one that's going to work, or that's where we like to live more, then to throw our lives into that model because that's what we like, and that's what we think. And to make our lives passionate about making this model or that model work, even as we understand that we just never know. We never at the end of the day know which model is going to work. We never at the end of the day know which vulnerabilities are going to prove trivial and which vulnerabilities are going to prove dramatic. We have to each invest in the community that is our own, and at the same time understand that we are part of a larger whole, and that what we all need to be invested in ultimately is not only the survival, but the flourishing of both models and of other Jewish communities around the world. We are going to have differences about policy. We're going to have differences about lots of things. We're also going to have fundamental, profound differences about how we see the world. If we can have a conversation now about how the other fundamentally sees the world, I think we can begin to build the kind of dialogue and discourse that will enable us to weather the dust-ups that are invariably going to come as we disagree about policy, and it will enable us to weather those dust-ups and to work together, even in different ways, to ensure the future vitality of the Jewish people for as far as the eye can see. Thanks very much.
So for 40 years, I've had the opportunity to say to myself, whenever Danny Gordis speaks, I listen, and I think we have all enjoyed his very important development and understanding of the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. We have time for a few questions, and so there are microphones. Donna has one, Eddie has one. If anyone has a question, it's either something that Danny discussed or something that he didn't get to discuss tonight in the time that we had. Okay, Debbie?
Hi. Is there a way for us to get our children and our grandchildren more involved with Israel and care more about its existence?
That's a very important question. Look, remember we talked about a little bit earlier about how American Jews, I think, see themselves fundamentally as a religion, whereas Israeli Jews think of themselves fundamentally as a people. Religions don't have states. Where's the Episcopalian state? Where's the Methodist state? Where's the Lutheran state? Where's whatever? In other words, religions don't have states. There are states that have religions, but religions don't have states. So part of the problem is that as long as American Jews define Judaism, both consciously and unconsciously, more as a religion than anything else, it's going to make the idea of statehood seem odd to a certain extent, that we would have a state, but other religions don't have states. So that's one thing that's swimming against us, or that's pushing against us. The other thing that's pushing against us, of course, is the larger cultural climate of Jews being fundamentally uncomfortable with difference, and Israel obviously making difference one of the very, very foundations of what it's all about. So our work is really stacked against us. I'd say there's a couple of things that we can do. Number one, we have to get them there. The kids that haven't been there, just they get it filtered through CNN or the New York Times or whatever, and it's just not the same thing. And we got to get them there. But Birthright is great. I mean, Birthright is an unbelievably impactful program, but it's not enough. In other words, we have to get them to kind of live inside the heads of Israelis, to read Israeli literature, to know what's going on in Israeli TV, and not just Fauda, to know what's going on. And America's not about, I don't know. America's not about some of the most obvious things that people. America's a complex place, and to understand it, you need to know a lot. We have to get them to really spend time there, and I think that's one thing that can actually be done. Number two is I think they need to know history. They actually have no idea how the occupation started. They know that they're opposed to it. They just don't know how it started. They don't know that King Hussein was warned by Israel in the 1967 war. We've destroyed Egypt's air force. That's over. We're taking over the Golan. Syria's almost done. You really don't need to get in this war. And if you get in this war, you're going to get trounced. So why don't you do the smart thing and stay out of the war? Israel sent people to Amman to go say that to him. And King Hussein made the following calculation. If I get in the war, I'm going to lose. If I stay out of the war, I'm going to lose my throne. Because my street will see me as having been unloyal or disloyal to the larger Arab cause. So I'm going to lose a whole lot of land, and I'm going to lose a whole lot of soldiers, a lot of tanks, a lot of planes, but I'm going to stay king. And he went into the war, and he got trounced, and hence we have Israel's occupation of the West Bank. How many people know that? How many people know that the PLO was formed to destroy the Jewish state in 1964, which last time I checked was before 1967? So the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is created to destroy the Jewish state before there's an occupation. How many of them know, if they can find it online, read Dan Polisar, Polisar, in Mosaic magazine, where he summarizes thousands I think, of Palestinian opinion polls, which show that basically 80% of Palestinians on the street today believe that the Jews have right to exactly 0.0 kilometers between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Are there some people who think otherwise? There are. Do 80% think the Jews have no right to live anywhere? That's at least what polls of Palestinians conducted by Palestinians seem to say. Now, in the face of all of that, what exactly should Israel do? I'm not saying do nothing, but I'm saying it's a lot more complicated than parading around on campus with a sign would seem to suggest. So they need to know a tremendous amount. They need to know the history. They need to get there. And they need to open themselves up to a multiplicity of viewpoints. And I'll just end with this. You're probably aware that Tzipi Chotovely, who's the deputy foreign minister of Israel, who is not a centrist and who is certainly not a leftist. He's a hard right-leaning person. She's very smart. She's not soft-spoken. She was supposed to speak at Princeton. I think it was 2 nights ago, or last night, 2 nights ago, whenever it was. And because she had spoken at Columbia a day or two earlier and had come out really, really hard right, and some of the students had gotten their feathers ruffled, Princeton Hillel decided to cancel her appearance. We got to stop living in a world in which we can't listen to each other, in which people shout each other down, as opposed to in universities, what you're supposed to do is actually go to listen to people who you disagree with. That's called learning. I don't need to listen to somebody I agree with. That doesn't challenge me. The shul that I go to in Jerusalem now, on Friday nights at least, I go to that shul because every time the rabbi speaks, she makes me think about something in an entirely different way than the way I used to think about it. But it really kind of turns my world upside down. That's what I want religion to do. I don't need to go to shul to feel good. If I want to feel good, I'll go to Yerada Carmel, the Carmel Spa, whatever it's called. Shul is not about feeling good. Shul's about having a rabbi that you respect and admire. And I think this woman is one of the most impressive people on the face of the planet, at least the ones that I've met, who says, going to make you uncomfortable tonight. Because that's what being Jewish is about. And then we're going to sing and we're going to bring in Shabbat together. I think that that's what American Jews need to train their kids and grandchildren to be open to. Go to hear people who you disagree with and listen and think. And your friends who disagree with you should listen to you, just like you should listen to them. So I think, number one, we've got to get them to be in Israel and understand it better. Number two, they need to know the history. Number three, they need to understand much better what the reality on the ground is today, which is much more complex than they have any idea. And number four, we have to create an intellectual world where people are actually much more open to hearing ideas that are different from their own. If we got that far, it's not a slam dunk. We're still going to be swimming against the tide. but I think we'd have a much better shot at capturing a bigger portion of the pie.
I think that number 5 of what you just said,
Yeah.
because I grew up here in this shul, and I've been living in Israel for the past 10 years. And I think that the idea of the two communities understanding one another is a beautiful idea and next to impossible from my own personal experience, but I'm hopeful. But I think also to speak Hebrew. If every Jewish person in America or anywhere really had some more than even basic knowledge of Hebrew, it would make a massive difference.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. I could not agree with you more. My parents, my father unfortunately no longer living, but my mom's still very much with us. My parents grew up in the larger New York area in the 1930s as young children. They both grew up in Hebrew-speaking homes. Now, I don't know how many of them there were, but my family is from 2 of them. And it was a Zionist statement. It was just a clear Zionist statement. We're on the verge of the Jewish people creating a homeland. Hebrew has been reborn, and you're going to learn Hebrew. And my father's father sort of drilled him in grammar on the way to and from shul, which I think made my father hate both grammar and shul, but that's a different conversation altogether. But I couldn't agree with you more. Look, part of the problem is that when we don't know a language, we have no access to the real heart and soul of another world. And so if you can't, we were just talking about this book before, if you can't read Asaf and Bari's book, Habaita, then and it's not been translated for complicated legal reasons, then you're just missing a great window onto Israeli life. And if you can't, what's on Times of Israel, which is a fantastic website, is not the same thing that's on the op-ed page of Makor Rishon or Haaretz or Yediot Achronot. What's on the op-ed page in those newspapers is just not translated into English. So how are we really supposed to know what Israelis are debating and so on and so forth? So I think, look, American Jewish kids are not stupider than they were 2 generations ago. If anything, they're smarter, right? And they go to good high schools and they learn French, or they learn Spanish, or they learn some other language. We have the capacity to learn a second language. And you're 100% right. We've given up on Hebrew, which I think is tragic, because what it means is we've given up on a window into the society, which is now the world's largest Jewish community. And if we could get that back, it would be an enormous accomplishment. I agree with you completely.
Given these profound differences you're talking about between Israel and American Jewry, it's pretty clear, though, that Israel needs American Jewry, needs our support militarily, financially, politically. I would argue the same thing is true on the reverse side. What happens next? How do we deal with that? We can't go our separate ways.
We actually can, and we might. I agree with you. My instinct is exactly like you. But most of the Israelis, for example, on my faculty that I teach with every day, when they hear somebody say that, they stop you in the middle. I don't, because I'm American and I was well raised and whatever. But they would say, no, what are you talking about? Do you know what $3 billion in aid is in the percentage of our military budget each year? It's nothing. And it's nice to have. It's a great win. And yeah, it's nice to have Iron Dome paid for by Congress. It's all good. We really like it. But can we live without it? 100% we can live without it. What do you think Bibi's doing in India all the time? What do you think Bibi's doing in China? What do you think they would say? Not me. What do you think he's doing out there? He's like trying to take a picture of himself on the Great Wall? Probably. But he's doing more than that at the same time. So Israelis aren't buying the idea, rightly or wrongly, they're not buying the idea that they are as dependent on American military aid as they once were. Clearly there's dependency, right? God forbid there's a war, you need spare parts for all the F-16s and all the F-35s, and the spare parts are made in America and they're not made in Israel, and if the spare parts get held up, it's a disaster. Yes, there is a tremendous amount of interdependence. But I think what most Israelis would say is that America does what America does for Israel because it's in America's interest. And if it wasn't in America's interest, it would make no difference what American Jews thought. And if it is in America's interest, it is also going to make no difference what American Jews think. That's what Israelis are saying to themselves. I don't know if it's right or if it's wrong, but I agree with you completely. We desperately actually need each other. We need each other not because of military stuff, but because, first of all, this is the most religiously creative Jewish community on the planet. There's liturgical creativity, musical creativity, a whole set of different things that are happening in America that Israel desperately needs to learn from. Israeli feminism, which is now rampant in Israeli modern orthodoxy, they did not get it from France and they didn't get it from Morocco. They got it from the United States. If you look in southern Jerusalem, at all of the institutions that I think are the shining lights of intellectual life in southern Jerusalem, Hartman and Pardes and the Israel Democracy Institute and the JPPPA and Shalem College, and there's probably another half a dozen that I didn't mention. They are all, not most, they are all founded by Americans and funded mostly by Americans. So I think that Israel's real dependence on Americans is its culture, its ethos of civility, which is, maybe we'll come back one day. I mean, I say that with great, no, I said it was utter seriousness and great sadness. And I think Americans are dependent on Israel for a reminder of, you don't really know a lot about yourself until you see the other. We send a delegation of students every year to San Francisco, which is very close to the United States, and we send them to Jewish San Francisco for 10, 12 days, and they come back shell-shocked. And what's interesting to me is we send everybody from Haredim to secular students. I mean, we have everybody, and we send the whole smattering of them. The ones who come back the most deeply upset are the secular students. The Haredi students, they go. The Orthodox students, they go. They look around and say, okay, it's not for me. It's interesting. Never been to a gay synagogue before. Now I've been to a gay synagogue. I've never been to a church that had a rabbi. Now I've been to a church that has a rabbi. There is called the Black Church has a rabbi. It's all good. They say, whatever. The secular ones go and they say, we went to a community high school, and for davening they had, non-egalitarian, egalitarian with yoga, egalitarian with more yoga, and then they just had yoga. And then they say, what do you mean yoga is davening? What makes that Jewish? And then they go back to the room at the end of the day and they say, well, if that's not Jewish, what makes my life Jewish? And they go through a very, very painful process of recognizing that it was going to San Francisco that got them to ask questions about their Jewishness in a way that nothing in Israel ever did. Experiencing the other is a very profound way of learning about ourselves. And that's why I think ultimately we really need each other. I think Israeli Jews desperately need to understand the creativity of America and its intellectual acuity, because that's part of what's really enriched Israeli life, and we need that to continue. And American Jews need to see that you can actually live a profound life in which, A, the larger thing of which you're a part is much more important than your own autonomy, that intellectualism and religion need not always be handcuffed or married one to the other, depending on which adjective you want to use, and that the use of military power, as ugly as it always is, no matter who's using it, is actually something worth celebrating, because for a very, very, very long time we didn't have it, and the results weren't really very good. So I think we need each other to kind of hold up mirrors to ourselves and to each other. Whether we really need each other for the diplomatic or the military stuff, look, I mean, I'm as huge a fan as Nikki Haley as anybody is, and it's a breath of fresh air. So I disagree with my Israeli friends who think it doesn't matter here. But just to make it clear, I think a lot of Israelis would say, actually, that they disagree with the premise. But I think you're right. We do need each other, and we have to start having that kind of a conversation, which is why I think the way that Bibi talks is really, really dangerous and really, really damaging on this particular issue. I mean, on many issues, but on this particular issue. I have to say, by the way, we really owe you a word of thanks, because until about a year ago, whenever I would speak and we have to talk about Bibi, I felt really, really self-conscious. I don't really feel so self-conscious anymore. I don't like him any more than I used to. I like him a lot less, but I don't feel self-conscious in the least. So thank you for that. But no, I think that Bibi's being very foolish and very short-sighted. Everybody says because he's got great English, he really understands American Jews. He doesn't understand American Jews at all. He speaks good English. That's about the extent of it. He doesn't understand this community, and hopefully subsequent people who take over that office whenever that happens will be people who really have a much greater openness to understanding the value of what American Judaism has to offer. Just give you one example, Yair Lapid, who I don't think is going to win, but certainly is in the running. Yair Lapid is an active member of a Reform synagogue. I think that's awesome. I think it's a much better thing than a person who says he's an Orthodox Jew and never steps in a shul. I actually think that having a prime minister who is a proud and active member of a Reform synagogue, which is obviously a derivative of American Judaism, which is in turn a derivative of German Judaism, would be an amazing thing for the world Jewish conversation. We'll get there. It's going to take some time.
Final question. Stand up, please.
There's been an influx of Israelis to New York and America and such. New York City in particular, you can feel Israeli presence. What impact do you think that has on the dynamic between the American Israeli, who's now an American, sort of, in this dynamic in the relationship?
So far, it's had very little dynamic, because until relatively recently, number one, American Jews weren't doing a hell of a lot to bring those Israelis into inner corridors of American Jewish life. So those Israelis were both perfectly anxious and happy to stay on the sidelines, as was the American Jewish establishment happy to have them on the sidelines. Of course, there were always exceptions, and there's for a very long time been people doing really great work, but for a very long time, the vast majority of those people were very much on the sidelines. That's changing a little bit. I mean, there's organizations like the IAC and others that are actually trying to galvanize and organize Israelis in this country, which, look, I think is great. And I think it's time for us to completely, wash our hands of any negativity about Israelis who move here, right? I mean, I actually don't live here, and I moved there. My wife informed me that we were moving there, so we moved there. No, that's actually 100% true, but that's beside the point. And I feel a twinge of sadness when people leave, just because I love the model so much, and it speaks to me so deeply that when somebody else doesn't quite feel that kvetch, it saddens me a little bit. But at the end of the day, I had every right to leave this country and go there, and they have every right to leave that country and come here. I mean, the great irony is that when Jews were leaving the Soviet Union and going to Vienna, from which they could choose either Tel Aviv or New York, it was during the time that Begin was prime minister, and Begin was seen as this far-right character and so forth. And a lot of Jews were choosing to come to New York, as you well know. And people went to Begin and said, you got to put a stop to this. This is ridiculous. They got to come to Israel. And Begin said, no, they actually don't. The whole point of getting them out of the Soviet Union was for them to be free. And the fundamental privilege of being in a Western society is being able to chart the course of your own life. Would I, Menachem Begin, like them to come to Israel? Of course I would. Would I do anything to block them from going to America? Absolutely not. And he actually, really, really annoyed a huge part of the Jewish establishment by saying that. But I think he was absolutely right. So far my sense is that it hasn't really colored it that much. But it's something that might be changing. And I'll say this by way of maybe just wrapping up. Interestingly enough, by the way, for all that a number of American Jews have made Aliyah, and the number's not huge, but it's also not infinitesimally small, it hasn't impacted Israel nearly as much as you would imagine. For example, there's been Russian political parties. There's never been an American political party. We had Golda Meir, was an American-born prime minister, obviously, but since her, we haven't had anybody with American roots who's been prime minister. And American Jews are very much involved behind the scenes, of the chief of staff to this one and the chief of staff to that one. But with the exception of Michael Oren, really, there's no real major candidates out there who are noticeably American with their American accent and so on and so forth. You hear Russian accents, you hear French accents, you hear Iraqi accents. You don't hear American accents. It's interesting that American Jews, for all their high-profile existence in Israel, certainly in Jerusalem, Ra'anana, and a few other places, haven't really had the huge impact in Israel that you'd think that they would have had also. Which is about saying that at the end of the day, American Jews have not been all that hospitable to Israeli Jews who've come here, and in a lot of ways, a lot of parts of Israeli society have not been nearly as hospitable to immigrants as we would have expected that they would have been given the history of the state. Which is all about saying this. We all have a tremendous amount of soul searching to do. I forget where the woman was who said that she's not optimistic. Okay, I mean,
No, I am.
You said you think it's.
I think it's impossible, but I'm optimistic.
Yes, I don't know exactly what that means. We can talk about that sometime. If it's coffee, I'll pay. If it's scotch, you pay. But I'm not sure what it means to sort of think it's impossible and be optimistic. But I share your sense that it's a very, very long shot. I really do share your sense of that. Because the instinct is just to be small. The instinct is to be narrow, and the instinct is to not think with an embrace. I think that the Jews have a long history of not thinking with embracing, and the Jews have a long history of writing each other off. I don't think it's a luxury that we have now. And I'll end on this note. Nothing brings the Jews together like anti-Semitism. No, I'm dead serious. Nothing brings the Jews together like anti-Semitism. The Mideast has a bit of it. Europe is awash in it. And for as long as I've been alive, which is not a very long time, but it's not a very short time either, this is the place in the world in which there was hardly, in the last several decades at least, a whiff of it. And that's now changing. And the great irony of intellectual life in Europe and America always has been that the far right and the far left, they always meet. The far right and the far left have met in Austria. The far right and the far left have met in France. And the alt-right and the far anti-Semitic left here are going to also meet. Where's that going? I don't think any of us has any idea. But what it demands is a certain amount of epistemological humility, meaning recognizing we don't know where this is going. Should anybody in their wildest imaginations wish for an era in which we need that to get us there? No. But I would say this, if we find ourselves facing a world in America and the Middle East which is much less hospitable to Jews and to Judaism and the Jewish people than it was a few decades ago, we're going to find ourselves needing each other much more than we thought we ever were. The challenge for us is to try to need each other that much without the threat from the outside. And I hope and pray that we can get there.
Please join me in thanking Danny Gordis for being here. There are books outside. There's jewelry to look at. Enjoy being together. Thank you all for being here tonight.